Last week, we took a sledgehammer to some of the most popular character advice out there. And wow, judging by the comments, it sounds like we all had that collective uh-oh moment, that dawning horror that our characters might just be checklist characters, little more than a laundry list of facts and flaws and backstory. And now that we've torn all that down, it's time to build something new. A framework I have been so excited to share with you that I like to call the character chain. Now, it's less of a rigid formula and more of this step-by-step process for forging characters that feel truly alive.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
The chain flows in a very specific order. It begins with a formative history, which shapes a flawed interpretation of the world. That flawed belief creates a powerful motivation, which then hardens into a default behavioral pattern. Pushing back against that pattern is their personal boundary, and the entire chain is set in motion by a final story-starting collision, pulling the plot in directions more exciting than anything you could have outlined on your own. All right, plot heads, before we dive into the first link, I want you to think about something. I want you to think if you yourself were being written as a character, because none of us just act randomly, although sometimes it seems like we do. But our personalities are shaped in an interesting way. They're shaped by what's happened to us, by the stories we tell ourselves about those moments, by what we're trying to prove, and maybe most of all, by what we're trying to avoid. And that is what we're building here. A character who exists independent of the plot, so that the second you throw conflict at them, you don't have to invent a reaction. You'll already know what your character will do. So let's get our hands dirty and forge the very first link. We start with history, which in this case is different than backstory, and you'll see why. Now, without this link, a character's actions can feel inconsistent and random because there's no anchor for their worldview. Now, what's really important for your character is looking for the specific formative moments that create their core beliefs. As we approach this, I want you to think of yourself as a journalist. We are only focused on the facts in this case. What happened? No feelings, no dramatic embellishments. Now, we'll get to all that juicy stuff later, I promise. Now, these formative events are the foundation of the entire chain, providing the objective cause that justifies all the psychological effects that follow. Now, to make this chain practical, let's answer a few questions for your character. First, what's a memory that plays on loop in their head? Second, what is the single biggest loss they've ever faced? And third, what's an achievement that they are most proud of, and what did it cost them? For example, maybe that memory is just the sound of a banging door as somebody leaves their life. Or perhaps for the biggest loss, it doesn't have to be a person, it could be maybe a family pet. Now, maybe the achievement was winning the third grade spelling bee, but it cost them their best friend after some friendly or not so friendly rivalry. Now, since I covered Avatar: The Last Airbender in world building, let's also cover it with character, because I want to talk about one of my favorite fictional characters and how this chain applies to them. Let's talk about Prince Zuko. Let's list his history here. The objective journalistic facts are these. He was the crown prince of the Fire Nation who spoke out of turn in a war meeting to defend soldiers. For this, his father, Fire Lord Ozai, challenged him to a duel. When Zuko refused to fight, Ozai called him weak, burned his face, and banished him. He was then told the only way he could return was to capture the Avatar, a functionally impossible task. So I hope you can see there how we're just going based off the facts there. But for humans, we don't just tolerate these big events in our life as some sort of meaningless void. Formative events like that create these unbearable sort of psychological anxieties and tensions within us. And resolve it, the character is compelled to basically create a story, create meaning out of it. Because as we've seen, stories are powerful. The ones that we tell other people and the ones that we tell ourselves. Because that story, your character's personal and often flawed truth, is the next link in the chain, interpretation. Now, if history is the raw footage, interpretation is really the story they tell themselves about it. And another way to think about this is an event is just a thing that happened, part of their history, until a character attaches meaning to it. Now, this crucial link, which is often missing in other frameworks, connects their past to their inner world. Because without a clear interpretation, a character's motivation can feel unearned or arbitrary or completely disconnected from the events that are supposed to shape them. Now, most powerfully, this becomes what I call the fundamental lie, that fundamental lie that your character came to believe. You see, this link is crucial because it's the source of all that internal tension and conflict we love to write. You see, a healthy interpretation of a past event creates a stable person. And stable people are lovely. We'd all like to be them, right? But they make for pretty boring protagonists. This is basically a reinforced flaw. That entire story that a character tells himself would then create pressure that strains that lie, forcing them into situations that challenge their core belief. Now, as the story goes on, that's where it becomes part of your character arc. So to find your character's lie, let's finish this sentence for them. Because blank, the event, happened, I now believe that blank. So for instance, you could have, because my parents praised my grades and nothing else, I now believe that achievement is the only way to earn love. Or perhaps it's, because I was publicly humiliated in middle school, I now believe I must never, ever be the center of attention. So you can start to see where the history then becomes that interpretation. All right, let's connect this back to Zuko and Avatar: The Last Airbender, so you can see it through the entire chain. So we know his history already, right? Because he was burned and banished for showing compassion, history, he creates his lie, the interpretation. He believes, my father's approval is the only thing that proves my worth. Compassion is a weakness, and to be loved, I have to be what my father values. Now, his entire sense of self is now chained to the approval of, I guess you'd call him his abuser. So that lie really becomes this unstable pillar at the core of their identity. And because it's inherently fragile, it demands this sort of constant, frantic defense. Because change, that's the hard part. Because if it shatters, basically their entire world shatters. Now here's the thing, that desperate need for validation doesn't just stay internal in your character. It also manifests as a tangible external goal, forging the next propulsive link in the chain, motivation or want. This link in the chain creates the pull that drives the plot forward. It's sort of the want and the need. Now, this is basically what separates a character who drives the story from one who just kind of gets chauffeured around by it. Now, if you saw my short about it, we don't want passenger princess characters because we really want them to have some agency in it. That motivation anchors the character's internal lie to an external, tangible goal. Ensuring the character's own need is what actively pulls the story forward. So, how do we find this? Well, a great way is what I like to call the fear and fix method. So I'll walk you through it. First, what's the core fear their interpretation creates, your character creates? Then, what's the one thing they believe will fix it? So let's try it out. That fear could be being seen as ordinary. So the fix would be committing a spectacular headline-grabbing crime. Instead of that, you could also use the in order to formula. Basically, I must blank action in order to blank prove my lie, prevent my fear. So to go deeper, ask yourself with me, what is your character desperately running from? What are they also desperately running toward? So let's use that fear and fix method for Zuko. His interpretation, as we've established, creates a core fear, being worthless and loved. The fix his brain devises is earning his father's approval. So his motivation becomes, I must capture the Avatar in order to restore my honor and finally earn my father's love. Now, this isn't just some goal. This is really like a desperate mission born from a profound terror of being worthless. Now, this pursuit becomes his entire reason for being, which is why Zuko later in the story has this incredible character arc and has to find out again who he is. Now, a motivation this powerful forces relentless action. And in that constant pursuit, the character discovers tactics that work. Basically, the mind hardens them into a default way of engaging with the world. Now, that autopilot becomes our fourth link, their behavioral pattern. Okay, let's just pause and take a break. First off, I just want to say thank you to everyone here. It has been so amazing to engage with you in the comments. I appreciate each and every one of you so much. Now, if this is helping you see your own characters in a new light, go ahead and hit that like and subscribe button. We'll be digging into so many more things regarding character coming up, so you won't want to miss it. All right, so we figured out the why that fuels our character. Now we need to figure out the how. What are the go-to moves? This brings us really to behavioral pattern, their default strategy for dealing with the world. Now, without a defined behavioral pattern, a character's actions can feel erratic. You're gonna break disbelief with your audience. They're gonna start seeing straight through your character. And I'm sure you've seen this contract broken in other movies and books before, where behavior starts coming out of characters that just doesn't feel in line with everything that we've known about them. This link is what makes a character feel really consistent and recognizable. But here's the really cool part. It also sets up future obstacles, because the most interesting part of a story happens when you introduce a problem their go-to methods just can't solve, when you really challenge your characters in unexpected ways. So here's a fun, practical way to define this. Let's use the when-then statements. Basically, when I feel threatened, then I intimidate people. When I'm scared, then I tell a joke. When I feel out of control, then I obsessively clean my apartment. This kind of goes into the psychology of it, but this gives you a clear, actionable list of behaviors. What is the trigger? What is the action? Now, I'm going to give you some questions that you can ask of yourself and your character. When the pressure is on, What's your character's first instinct? Is it to fight, to flee, to charm, or maybe to outsmart the problem? It could be multiple different things. Then how do they get what they want from strangers versus people they love? Now that's an interesting one. And then what's a tactic your character leans on way too much, even when it's clearly not working anymore? Because sometimes it's hard to break those habits, break those behaviors. Now let's take this and let's connect it back to our favorite fire prince, Zuko. So for Zuko, to capture the avatar, his when then statement is simple. It's, when I face an obstacle, then I use force and intimidation. If that fails, I just keep chasing it down. If I'm completely lost though, I turn to my Uncle Iroh for advice, even if I argue with him first. Man, I absolutely love Uncle Iroh. Such a good character. Now this pattern creates consistency, but it also creates crucial blind spots for your character. As the character over relies on this one strategy, they begin to unknowingly sacrifice other parts of themselves. Now this really creates internal friction, a quiet but persistent war where their authentic self, the person they could have been, starts pushing back against the restrictive armor they built. Now that powerful point of internal resistance forges our fifth link, their boundary. Now we get to what might be my favorite link in the entire chain. Truly defines characters and stops them from being predictable. It really makes them feel profoundly human. Now without a boundary, a character feels one-dimensional. They will lack the internal conflict that makes them feel real. Now, a boundary is really just a line they will not cross. It is valued so sacred that they will protect it, even if it means failing their primary motivation. Now, a way to think about this is it's like your character's small flame that they're holding deep inside of themselves. It's really their last piece of their authentic self, this sort of whisper of who they could have been, refusing to be silenced. Now, a character's true nature is not revealed by what we've talked about, the behavior going on autopilot. No, instead it's revealed when their behavioral pattern strains against this deeply held value. And here's a really fun part. This level, boundary, this is often the exact moment where heroes and villains diverge. Because when the story forces them to choose between their motivation and their boundary, or to rhyme the goal versus their soul, the hero is the one who will sacrifice the goal. The villain is the one who decides the prize is worth the price and crosses that line. So to find this, let's use what I call the even I have standards test. So have your character finish this sentence. To get what I want, I'll do almost anything, but I will never blank. And that blank is your boundary. So maybe one could be, to get rich, I will lie and cheat, but I will never steal from family. Sounds like a swell guy. A good story will pull them right up to that line and probably dare them to cross it, just like Batman and his code about not killing. Now, Zuko's lie, to go back to our main example, is that honor comes from strength and compassion is weakness. But his boundary is a deeply buried belief in true honor, which means protecting the innocent. So when his behavioral pattern, relentless pursuit, gives him a chance to capture the avatar, his motivation is screaming, do it, but his boundary pulls him back with equal force. Iroh is essentially an extension of that boundary, a personified version of his boundary. Now, that agonizing tension is the war for his soul. The battle between what he's been conditioned to want and what he knows is right will ultimately put so much pressure on his lie from earlier, his interpretation, that it has no choice but to shatter. The chain is pulled tight, stretched between the forward pull of their motivation and the anchoring resistance of their boundary. Now, this tension is what creates a powerful, specific internal vulnerability. Basically, this is their psychological fault line. And all that's left is for an external event or character to strike that exact point. And that's where character arc happens. That's where change happens. And that event is our final link, the collision. Without it, the plot just happens to your character. With it, the plot happens because of your character. This is where plot and character collide. And that collision is what shackles your protagonist to the inciting incident. Not with a random problem, but with a guided missile aimed directly at their most fragile point, that psychological fault line between their motivation and their boundary. Now, the plot becomes a question their soul cannot ignore. So how do we build this? Let's look at three great options. Well, first, you could always use a foil with an opposite worldview, like a cynical thief is forced to team up with a wide-eyed optimist. Second, you have a system breaker. Basically, a brilliant strategist must solve a problem that has almost no logic and is only chaos. That's going to pit them against what they most fear. Now, third, you could also do a boundary test. Basically, this is like a dedicated pacifist gets drafted into a war, which is basically Hacksaw Ridge. And often the most powerful collisions happen when two fully formed character chains smash right into one another. One character's core motivation might be a direct threat to the other's boundary. One character's behavioral pattern might be the very thing that created the other's formative history. This is what generates real sparks in the story and where characters start to collide. So let's go back to Avatar: The Last Airbender one last time. So look at Zuko. The perfect collision for him is his uncle Iroh, who is a walking opposite worldview. Zuko's chain was forged in exile and shame. Iroh's was reforged in grief and acceptance. So when they interact, it's really a collision of two deeply forged souls. Now the friction from that impact is what generates the story's most powerful heat, constantly straining Zuko's core interpretation that his worth is conditional. So there you have it. That's the blueprint. That's the character chain from beginning to end. What makes a character feel real? It starts with a history to ground them in pivotal moments, builds a flawed interpretation to create internal tension, gives them a motivation to pull the plot forward, establishes a behavioral pattern to make them consistent, and then challenges that with a boundary to create profound choices. Finally, the collision sets the entire chain in motion, tying your plot to your character's deepest struggles. Now, before you go, let's turn this into something fun. Drop one of your favorite characters in the comments. It could be a hero, villain, anti-hero, whoever you'd like to see me cover and use this framework on. And once again, I'm Brian. This is Plot Luck. And if you've ever loved a story, felt let down by one, or dreamed of telling your own, pull up a chair, hit subscribe, and let's stir the plot together. That's a wrap.